So in chapter 14, Robbins covers padding, borders, margins. These are really important to making your page look good. They give you a lot of control. So we're going to go over these CSS properties with using this really simple page. It's got one heading, one image, and 3 paragraphs of text, basically, unless you count the 2 links, 5 paragraphs. But the HTML, also pretty simple. There's nothing here that you haven't seen before. And we are going to be dealing with this area that I've contained inside a div. All right, so from line 17 to line 27, it contains 4 paragraphs, all right? And so this div is like a wrapper or shrink wrap around these 4 paragraphs, and I'm going to manipulate this div to teach you about padding, borders, and margin. And you'll notice that our div has an ID, not a class, but an ID. And there are a lot of similarities between the way we use a class and an ID, but the two are different. In this case, we're using an ID. And you'll see in the CSS that to specify properties for an ID, we use a hash mark or an octothorpe, whereas if container were a class, it would have a dot in front of it. But it's an ID, so it has a hash mark, or it's also called an octothorpe. So what we're going to do first in the container is we are going to make the background white so you can see exactly what the div contains. And so I will go in here using something you know very well by now, background, and the color white, FFF, and I will save, and I will reload. And so everything that was contained in that div, in the HTML, has a white background at this point. And we don't have any special styles on this page at all. We've given a background color. We've made the font a little bigger. The CSS here is simple. We have a color on the background. We have a font family. We have a font size. We have the container, which has one property specified. And we have the simplest possible link specification just for colors. So the next thing I want to do is put a width on that div, the container, so that it doesn't go all the way across the page. As Robbins points out, a block element will go 100% of the way across the page, from side to side, from left to right. So if you want it to be less wide than 100%, you need to give it a width. And in this case, I'm going to give it a width of 600 pixels because the image happens to be 600 pixels wide. So when I save and I reload, you'll see that now my div is exactly the same width as my image. And you know, this might be nice. This might help with the kind of layout that you want to make. So the next thing I want to add to this div that we're working with is padding, to show you where does the padding go. Is it going to be inside the white area, or is it going to be outside the white area? And Robbins talks about this in a really good way. A lot of beginners get confused about this. So let's see, where does the padding go? And I'm going to use the shorthand padding, which puts padding on all 4 sides, top, right, bottom, and left, with one simple declaration. All right, so padding 20 pixels. Save, reload, and what has happened? So you see what padding is. Padding gives us a nice buffer between the text that's inside a container and the edge of the container, making it look much nicer, not so crowded or cramped. I might even want more padding on the left and right here. So since you learned from Robbins that the order of sides for padding, margin, and border is top, right, bottom, left, but if you only specify 2 measurements, the first one will be for top and bottom, the second one will be for the sides. So if I want the sides to be wider than the top and bottom, what I've done here is I've specified the top and bottom to have padding of 20 pixels and the left and right to have padding of 40 pixels. So I'll save and I'll reload, and now you see that the sides have gotten just a little wider. But what has happened to our width? Have you noticed that the whole box keeps getting wider when we are adding padding? And this can be an issue. This can really mess up your design because look, now the white box, the div, it's noticeably wider than the image. When we started out, they were both 600 pixels wide. And this is another important thing to understand about how do browsers work and how does CSS work. We told this container, this div, we told it to be 600 pixels wide. But when we add padding, it keeps getting wider and wider. In some layouts, this is really going to ruin your day and make things very difficult for you. So there's a workaround that helps us make the browser do what most of us think it would do, and that is, I told you to be 600 pixels wide, darn it, stay 600 pixels wide. And I've got that over here on my scratch page. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to copy just the simple one line, and go over here, and I'm going to also add that within my rules for the container div, and I'm going to tell the browser to use the border box value for box sizing. Save, reload, and now what? Now I still have my padding, but my width is exactly 600 pixels the way it was in the beginning. And this was only achieved because I added box sizing. Now you may wonder why on my little scratch pad did I have 3 different versions of this same thing. They all say border box. Robbins explains this. I send you to her, but different browsers can require different properties in CSS, and that's what we see here. So to be really, really safe, instead of the simple single one that I did, we should really use all 3 of them to be really, really safe. And I'm going to push that over one. This is a way to ensure that your container stays the width that you told it to be, no matter what you put inside it, no matter how much padding you add, no matter how large of a border you add. So save, reload, looks the same as it did before. So I'd like to quickly show you how borders work, and I want to add a border to the div that we've been doing everything else with. So I'll switch over to our CSS, and here in the same rule for the container, I'm going to use the shorthand way of writing border, because usually we want all 4 sides of the border to look the same. So in that case, if none of the sides has to be different, you can do it all in one line. That's the simplest way. So a simple border, a very standard, usual kind of border, is to make it 1 pixel wide, to use the solid style. This means a thin, solid line. And color, let's see, I have a color handy, and I will copy and paste that. And semicolon, don't forget that. So I save, pop over to the browser, reload, and it doesn't make a huge difference because the color that I used isn't very, very dark, but I hope you can see that there is a small border at this point. If I make it wider, make it 10 pixels, save, reload, now you can certainly see it, and you can make a border pretty wide if you really want to. I mean, you can make a really fat border, save 40 pixels, reload, and you might want to try one of the other styles, like groove, right? So although it's kind of cheesy to use the groove and the ridge, people don't usually use those, not like real designers. So that's pretty much all we need to know about border, and the fact that the border has not made our container any wider than 600 pixels, and that is because we have the box sizing in place. If we take the box sizing off, the border is going to make the box wider than the 600 pixels. So I'm going to remove the border and put everything back to normal for the next bit of demonstration. Reload, there we go. Now I'd like to talk about height adding height to elements such as div or article or section. We do not have a height specified, and so the div just expands to hold all the content that we've got, all the text. So is it okay to add height? Well, sometimes maybe, but usually no. And I'll show you what happens if we add height onto this div that we've got. So let's say I add a height of, I'm not sure what would be good, maybe 100 pixels. All right, so I'll save and I'll reload, and what happens to my div? The text is all still there, but now the div isn't big enough to hold it, and it turns out 100 pixels is really, really small. For the next thing I want to try, let's try 300. That might be better. All right, so this doesn't look right, right? This is not something that you would want to see. But there's a neat other property that we haven't looked at yet in CSS, and that is called overflow. So if you use overflow together with height, in some cases, and this is pretty rare, if you say auto for automatic, save, and reload, what you'll get is a scroll box. Okay, so our white div goes right down to the edge of the page. There's nothing left below it. I think this would look better if I put a margin on the bottom. So I think I will put a margin bottom, let's say 50 pixels, save, reload. All right, so now we have a little bit of extra space at the bottom, and we've got a scrolling box here because of overflow auto. Very useful thing to know. There are several values for the overflow property. Another one is hidden, and you won't probably think of a good use of this for a while since you're still a beginner, but now there's no scroll bar, and the text that we had in there, it's just cut off. So much better than the time when the text was sort of half in white and half outside in the green. But obviously we can't read all the text, so in this case, not such a good thing. Overall, I'm trying to show you that height is usually not necessary, and usually it's not preferred, but there are cases, particularly if you're going to use overflow, when height can be used and it might be useful to you. All right, so save, reload, back to normal. Now we have a little margin on the bottom. Let's see, the next thing I want to show you, again, sort of a quick thing, is border radius. Border radius is a kind of a neat thing, very simple to use. And we'll put a border radius on here of 20 pixels. So this is, again, a shorthand. You can do border radius top, border radius right, left, bottom, but if you're going to have the same border radius on all four corners, then you can just use the shorthand border radius, nothing else after it. So save and reload, and do you see what happened to our borders? They got a little bit rounded. Now let's make that number of pixels bigger to make it really, really obvious what we're doing and how nice it looks. There we go. So we've got 4 rounded corners, and this can be applied to not only to a div, it can be applied to all kinds of elements. So just to show you, we can actually copy that and put it on an image. We only have one image on the page, right? So we're going to see what happens. The image itself gets rounded borders just like that. So border radius, sometimes you might want to use that. It might be cool. And like the box sizing, border radius, to be super, super safe, we should be using the WebKit prefix and the Moz prefix. So we should really have 3 border radiuses, one with WebKit, one with Moz, one that's just like this. But since I'm going to cut that off and not keep it, I'm not going to put that in. And we'll take the border radius off as well. Save and reload. We have one more important property to cover, and that is margin from chapter 14. I'm going to put that in a separate video, but it's really important. It's important pretty much across the board all the time, so make sure you watch that short additional video.